Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? The first story comes from British Columbia, where the Colonial Service has begun asking the public to help identifying the ongoing spate of feet found randomly. Yes, detached human feet at various stages of decomposition have washed up on the shores of the Salish Sea in British Columbia, 20 since 2007. The ongoing assumption is that this isn't a mass murderer, but a number of unfortunate people who during the process of decomposition have had their feet disconnect from the body and float to the surface in the chute, which has protected them from decomposing further. Unfortunately, identifying someone from a foot alone is very difficult, and for this reason, the government agency has asked people to help them identify who these feet belong to, which is an interesting challenge all of its own. Finding who the dead person is when you only have a foot. It's almost the reverse of Cinderella. Speaking of old fairy tales and trauma, a deadly disease caused by raw milk has landed 19 states in trouble. In the United States of America, these states have had to issue warnings after people consumed raw milk. That is milk that has not been pasteurized to try and remove much of the potentially deadly bacteria. Quite obviously, there is a market for those who do not believe pasteurization is essential. In 2018, at least one New York resident was diagnosed with a particularly nasty bacterium after drinking raw milk. The CDC confirms that raw milk has in fact caused a number of issues, particularly those that contain a rare strain of the Brucella bacterium. This is important because it is resistant to antibiotics that are used at the initial stages of an infection. Although not on the same level as methicillin-resistant Staph aureus, it is a substantial problem, as people are willingly exposing themselves to a antibiotic-resistant bacterium that will only further affect their recovery if they don't die. The amazing thing is that pasteurization as an effective means of controlling contaminated food was discovered in the mid-19th century. Pasteur is one of the more famous people associated with this process, and people are now starting to ignore it. Roughly 150 years, and suddenly people have decided, oh, this thing that has been working? No, we don't like it anymore. It's a problem, and while they're not responsible for finding feet randomly, their stupidity is a problem. There is almost no evidence that supports a benefit to raw milk, and almost no evidence that pasteurization causes harm to the milk's nutritional value. Therefore, you are gaining a safe food without the loss of any particularly good benefits from it. This seems like a win-win scenario, and yet there is resistance. The figures are somewhat alarming. From 1993 to 2012, raw milk created 127 hotspots, 2,000 individual patients, and 144 of these were hospitalized. Some of these were caused by the particular bacterium that's been an issue recently, Brucella. The problem is, in the 5 years between 2007 and 2012, the number of annual outbreaks quadrupled. 4 times in 5 years. That's not an average growth rate, that is a substantial problem. While the exact cause is unknown, the solution is very simple, and it goes back to the 1800s. Unfortunately, this is not the only thing from the 1800s that we should be paying attention to. There are a number of diseases that were largely treated, and we had evidence from the 1800s on how to solve them that are making a comeback, particularly in the UK. This has covered things like dietary diseases like scurvy, scarlet fever, whooping cough, and gout. All have had substantial increases in the last few years. The sad part is that much of this could be avoided through fairly basic public health measures, if they were funded adequately. But in many countries, and particularly the UK, this has not been the case. One thing that has not been affected, largely, is access to vaccines. However, there is a growing population of parents who are choosing not to vaccinate their children. This leads their children in turn, once they are of an age to understand what's happening, to seek advice on getting vaccinated. Of all the places that could possibly be turned to, though, it is in fact Reddit that is one of the more popular. These are teenagers who, once they turn 18 and are legally able to make their own medical decisions, are trying to find how they can be vaccinated against either family dogma, anti-vaxxer cults, or whatever other bizarre concept has taken their parents' mind. These are often diseases that have come from the 1800s that we have been able to prevent through simple vaccine programs. The advantage to these programs, and the advantage their parents, who are now mad, seem to have received, is they survived being children, an opportunity that in some ways they are denying their own children. The fact that these children have survived to 18 years and can now seek their own medical advice is rather impressive. What is less impressive is the need for this to happen. The number of people living in areas where there is a startlingly high percentage of people who are not vaccinated is a concern, and it is good for these children to be able to figure out for themselves they are of benefit compared to the prospective problems. This comes at a time where there are a number of measles outbreaks occurring, measles being one of the more easily communicated diseases. The problem with this is that pregnant women are particularly being targeted, as they seem to have given up on adults, or the adults have reached such a mass that they feel they need to spread their wisdom, so to speak, to others. This in and of itself is a problem. According to the CDC, there have been more than 100 cases of measles in January. That is more than there was in the entire year of 2016. 1 month is more than an entire year, and there is yet 11 more months to go. The problem with this is that it can drastically affect a child or young adult. Measles, as an example, can cause sterility in males and disfiguring scars. These targeted advertisements have relied on scaremongering particularly. They have distorted facts and outright lied in some cases. This has led to vaccination rates dropping like crazy in certain areas of America. Again, this is often due to lies, mistruth, or complete and utter distortion of any facts. The primary delivery mechanism for this has been Facebook, where targeted ads were the vehicle of choice for anti-vaxxer propaganda. Much to everyone's surprise, though, Facebook has pushed back. Where Facebook, among other tech giants, would generally be seen as supporting the liberal agenda, they appear to have taken a contrary stance, which may owe to pushback from the government in each state. In particular, the Democrat representative for California has expressed concerns over the avenues of dissemination for this misinformation. The reason for this concern is that the World Health Organization has described vaccine hesitancy or anti-vaxxers as one of the biggest global health threats of 2019. This hesitancy, as they choose to call it, is often a result of bubbles. Anti-vaxxers congregate with other anti-vaxxers, and it creates an echo chamber, or a small bubble, in which the same information is handed around and reiterated on, which only leads to them believing one particular truth, and bringing in outside information that contradicts what is claimed is difficult, if not outright bannable. They will often cite pseudoscience and conspiracy as evidence of why factual information from properly conducted studies is incorrect, or they will rely heavily on anecdotes. The problem Facebook and other tech giants face is that none of what is done in these groups is technically against their terms of service, and the real-world harm that is a requirement to violate them is often not quite there. Now, there is an arguable case that in the long term, there is a real-world harm. Unfortunately, the possibility of a future event is simply not able to be acted on. This is not the first time Facebook has tried such a measure of control on misinformation. Most recently, they began working with Snopes. The problem there is that insiders report that Facebook restricts what they can and cannot debunk, and so misinformation, when filtered through Snopes, is often cherry-picked. Facebook claims at the minute that they are attempting to roll out a very new system. This system is meant to make information about vaccines more accessible, and that it will prevent as much information as possible. Unfortunately, this runs into another problem involving both freedom of speech and what Facebook's role is. Unfortunately, Facebook doesn't have any obligation to prevent misinformation from being spread. The only counter to that is to try and have people who are in these groups provide accurate and reliable information that is correct. But this also leads to the second problem. Individuals have a freedom of speech, particularly in America where Facebook is based, and they are allowed to say what they want about vaccines, and this is where those echo chambers grow. Secondary to that problem is that Facebook needs to make money, and anti-vaxxer groups are willing to pay to provide ads, particularly those targeted at pregnant women. This means they can't refuse the money for these people who are willing to pay, particularly due to the Freedom of Expression and Anti-Discrimination Acts. Fortunately, at least one celebrity is coming back to stop this with their freedom of expression. Harrison Ford, who you may better know as Han Solo or Indiana Jones, has urged the world to stop giving power to science deniers. This would also include anti-vaxxers. Although his statement and speech at the time were intended to target the politically influential and powerful, his statements are not just only limited to that. They have bearing upon other groups and other individuals. For a man in his 70s, he carries himself well and his speech is worth listening to. Although focusing on environmentalism, the relevance of it to other fields is still there and should still be felt by anyone who listens to his speech. The importance of vaccinations is apparent to those who have suffered under them most recently. The best example of this is in US counties where measles outbreaks have occurred. Following this, vaccination rates have skyrocketed, increasing by 500% in some cases. In one particular county, 80% or just under of kindergarten children were vaccinated. That is, 8 in 10 children were vaccinated, well below the 95% vaccination rate for herd immunity. With such a large proportion of kindergarten-aged children, it is no wonder that after an outbreak they have had to order so many more doses of their measles vaccine. No parent wishes to see their child suffering under the effects of measles. On the other hand, it should never have been necessary for it to occur in the first place. Anti-vaxxers are causing harm, but it would appear that people are learning their lesson, and there is much support from those with influence to see that people understand why vaccines are important. Remember that vaccines are safe. The FDA monitors and sustains monitoring of vaccines for the life of their use. Vaccines go through one of the most rigorous approvals processes. This is unlike the next story about supplements. Supplements are now receiving more of an examination by the FDA. It is a $40 billion industry in America, and that has attracted people who are engaging in unscrupulous practices. This involves claims of health benefits that are either illegal or simply impossible. One of the more common ones regards cancer and other diseases where there is no treatment beyond what is medically available. Claiming that your product will help in curing it is simply false advertising, creates false hope, can in the long term do much more harm. A standard multivitamin will provide you with much of the same benefit that a highly specialized, and often not prescribed, supplement will do. This is because in the 1930s, it was established that vitamins and nutrients will help with many diseases like rickets and scurvy. In more recent years, superfoods and similar topics have created an industry of people saying that this thing, such as goji berries or similar, will lead to a massive increase in your health, with little or no evidence to back it up. This is the unscrupulous practices. As a consequence, the FDA has now started looking at it as an industry and finding that many of the claims made are unsubstantiated, or in fact are quite contrary to what the product will do. In other cases, products don't even contain the specified active ingredient. This will mean that although you may be taking something that theoretically could help you, you may not even be getting the very thing you are supposed to have purchased. The reason that these companies and individuals have been able to get away with this for so long is that supplements are not a highly regulated industry. As a consequence, the FDA only steps in when they believe there is a problem. That they are looking at the industry as a whole should indicate there is a substantial problem. Much of this can be related to the language used. If a company is smart, they will use words that do not breach the rules for a non-evaluated drug, or more accurately, supplement. This means that they can make claims that aren't necessarily the claims that you think they're making. This is a language barrier, and one that is being addressed. Another example of language that isn't always clear is that between chimps and humans. A recent study investigated the evolutionary roots of communication between chimps. The noises they make, the gestures they use, and the expressions they wear obey some of the same fundamental rules that humans use in communicating. What was found in this particular study was that when the researchers began to group particular gestures into their defined general category, that they had a strong correlation between frequency of use and meaning. This was further then built on to identify efficiency as the primary underlying reason. Short, simple gestures, expressions, and vocalizations were used more frequently than longer, more complicated ones. Chimps have, of course, always been a means of evaluating and investigating the ape brain being very much like the human brain, as we are, for all intents and purposes, just a naked monkey. For the same reason, scientists have grown a primate brain in a dish, with all of these structures on a two-dimensional plane. The way this was done was that the researchers took biochemically active brains from chimpanzee, combined them with human stem cells, and then grew them in a petri dish effectively. This is not just one or two cells, but it is an entire brain. This is not a brain in the terms of an anatomically correct structure. Rather, it is more like an organ on a chip. This is a situation in which the cells will self-organize once they are put into a solution together. Because it is a combination of both brain cells and stem cells, this allows for identification through gene expression, biochemical markers, and structure. Because it is grown from relatively little, it allows the researchers to halt their research at different stages of development, which means they can identify the necessary biomarkers, genes, and development at each stage. Another discovery of commonality is the idea of 7 rules that underlie universal moral standards in most cultures. This was found by analyzing a large number of cultural records from a large number of societies around the world, in fact the largest to date. What they found was that there are 7 rules. These can be summarized as helping those you know, helping those around you, giving back, doing what has to be done, following orders, sharing, and property rights. And these were almost universal in how they came across from the study, and that these particular cooperative behaviours may be the norm for humans. This would be an interesting way of looking at evolution if it were true, and carried back into a number of historical populations. Another historical moment was that NASA has finally declared Opportunity rover is dead. After 15 years, and as a very early Valentine's Day gift to the world, NASA declared that they had been unable to resume communication with Opportunity. Opportunity is the twin to Spirit, the other rover on Mars. It was originally only designed to last 90 days on the Martian surface, having survived well beyond this initial expected lifetime. It has since provided some of the most compelling evidence for liquid water on Mars. The Opportunity rover has had a far more successful life, despite its anticipated lifetime, than Mars 1. Mars 1 being the startup that promised to be a TV show to fund a crewed mission to Mars. This reality television show was meant to provide funding for a crew to go to Mars and set up a colony. However, they have now lodged bankruptcy paperwork. Although not dead yet, it's likely to be announced very soon that the company will be completely liquidated and the entire project scrapped. Yet another thing heading towards the chopping block are ketogenic diets. Good examples of this include the paleo diet or paganism that was mentioned last week. In either case, a massive study that involved 447,000 people around the world published findings recently. What the author found is not particularly surprising. Eat plenty of simple food like fruits and vegetables, eat everything in moderation, and vary your diet. Don't eat too much meat and other similar foods such as dairy, oils, sugars, so on. Nothing particularly surprising, and yet it has huge implications for these fad diets. What is surprising and interesting is that although fad diets are effective at losing weight, people who follow them also die earlier. And this is not the only study this week that has dealt a blow to fad dieting. Veganism was also hurt. Another study explored the effects of things like the New Nordic diet, Mediterranean diet, and the vegan diet. These all have certain benefits, certain arguments for them, and certain arguments against them. The takeaway, though, was that the Mediterranean diet trumped the vegan diet. The theory behind this is that the Mediterranean diet made more nitric oxide available. Nitric oxide acts as a form of antioxidant, which prevents damage to the body when it is stressed. The vegan diet also had a reduction in certain important micronutrients, B12 and iodine being particularly pronounced. B12 was supplemented throughout the trial. Despite that, there was still a substantial reduction. This is a particularly important finding, as microvitamins, nutrients, and minerals are something the body needs, particularly in small quantities, and they only exist in small quantities in the body, meaning any deficiency is a significant health problem. The researchers concluded quite strongly that a balanced diet is often more beneficial in the long term for anyone who wishes to lose weight and live healthy than to go on any particular one restrictive diet. This matches with the other evidence exploring the effects of ketogenic diets, which are also very restrictive. These two studies support the idea of eating fresh food that is relatively unprocessed, minimizing the amount of meat but not removing it entirely, and other fairly common sense approaches. This meshes with a third study that examined the effect of eating ultra-processed food. Ultra-processed in this case refers to something that's been mass-produced, such as snacks, sugary drinks, and particularly ready-made meals. These had an association with a higher risk of mortality over the study period. The methodology was observational, which means the exact mechanism underlying any increase in mortality from this ultra-processed food was not elucidated. It did, however, indicate that there is a strong reason to investigate this area further. This could be a consequence of the high calorie content of much processed food, the fact that it includes a lot of other products that are not present in fresh food, or any number of other possible occurrences. As the authors themselves say, a vital takeaway message is that consumption of highly processed foods reflects social inequalities. Such foods are attractive because they tend to be cheaper, are highly palatable due to high sugar, salt, and saturated fat content, are widely available, highly marketed, ready to eat, and their use-by dates are lengthy, so they last longer. This is important when you look at the population that tends to have the highest mortality and morbidity rates. More so when you compare it to who exactly would be following the first two dietary study guidelines. Those on a ketogenic diet tend to be more affluent. Those who are on the Mediterranean diet tend to be in a country that has access to plenty of fresh food. Those who are vegan, again, tend to be somewhat more affluent or uneducated. Those who are eating highly processed food tend to be uneducated or poor or both. The socioeconomically disadvantaged tend to have more diseases, and hopefully there's a new drug coming on the market, which is a Trojan horse that targets cancer in particular. A program funded by the National Health Service in the UK and run by researchers from the Institute of Cancer Research London and the Royal Marsden NHS Foundation are investigating something they call Tisotumab vedotin, or simply TV. This is made up of an antibody and a cytotoxic compound, which can damage cancer cells. An antibody is useful because it is very specific. Unlike most medication which simply saturates tissue, an antibody will only hit its target. Therefore, it is much like a heat-seeking missile that will find where it needs to go and hit that thing, but it will not affect other things. Take most chemotherapy agents at the minute, and you'll find that they have many side effects because they are not precise. This new clinical trial could very much have an effect on the ability to treat cancer effectively. What's more important is it is not a single target, but 6 cancer strains that can be hit with this one particular monoclonal antibody. This includes cancer of the cervix, bladder, ovary, endometrium, esophagus, and lung. Although this new treatment is not perfect, it is a substantial improvement over other drugs at the minute. For a patient with cancer, any improvement is well taken. This is now moving on to phase 2 clinical trials, and hopefully there will be results from that in the next 12 to 18 months. Although at the same time, we are trying to make people better through targeting 6 cancers, a new viral challenge is slowly deteriorating the number of people who should continue to breed. There is a viral boiling water challenge, and it's simply stupid. The process for this viral challenge involves boiling water and hurling it into the air. Now, in America at the moment, the drastic cold snap reacts with the boiling water and causes it to suddenly freeze. The way this is done is by throwing it above their head. If this is not done correctly, you have boiling hot water fall back on you. There have been a number of people admitted to hospital after trying this particular trick, and it's, as said, simply stupid. Unless it is done correctly, it is incredibly dangerous. The final story from this week is by a Dutchman. They have created a video where you can watch a single cell develop into an entire salamander in the course of 6 minutes. Watching the embryogenesis from cleavage through gastrulation and then finally organogenesis is something remarkable to watch. If you found this video interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions below.